Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 50 minutes or so. Well, after 96 hours of vote counting, after millions and millions of Americans going to their respective polls, it is of course official. The magic number of 270 was achieved by Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. He will be the 46th President of the United States of America. Well, the current president, which is of course Donald Trump, is contesting it. The question is, will he of course let go of one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful position in the world? Or will Joe Biden go ahead and have his seat in the White House? Well, we will be discussing the US elections and, of course, what happens when Joe Biden takes his seat in the White House. So joining me for this discussion, I have Mr. Brooks Spector. He is a former US diplomat and he is, of course, the current associate editor at the Daily Maverick. Good evening, Mr. Spector, and thank you so much for joining us here on Truth to Power on ITV Networks.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Now,
You're quite right. It was a long contested, still in some ways contested election, but ultimately 100 and some extraordinary number of Americans, 150 or million or so, voted in this election. It just took a while to get all the votes counted.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you, Mr. Spector. And of course, as you say, the duration of it, I don't remember, ever since I've been, of course, keeping an eye on the US elections, which of course was around 2000 when President George W. Bush won the election. But I haven't seen an election so drawn out after so many days. How did it come to this, Mr. Spector, that we had 96 hours of vote counting and for there to be an eventual result?
Well, I mean, traditionally, historically, election day didn't mean there was an answer. Obviously, in the years before television, the vote counting took place at a fairly stately process, state by state, and then the decisions of the citizens in each state were converted to the electors, and then that information was dutifully sent on to the Congress, where it officially was certified a couple of weeks, well, actually almost about a month after the election, but that was in an earlier time. And then the inauguration of a new president wasn't until March. So there would be several months that continued before the transfer of power actually took place. And it's really only been since the age of television and other electronic communication where we've come to expect that the answer will be in front of us by midnight or so of election day. And even in 2000, as you were noting, we didn't actually have an answer because the voting in Florida was so close that the votes were recounted, not a new election, but the votes themselves were recounted several times before it finally ended up in the Supreme Court in a rush. And the Supreme Court voted that the tabulation that gave George W. Bush a very narrow margin would stand. And then at that point, Albert Gore, who was his opponent, conceded in a very graceful concession speech, even though the contestation had been particularly harsh and almost angry. But now we're habituated with the idea that by the time the election day is finished, then television networks and other electronic news sources will have all the numbers, will have everything, and they will be able to, as they say, call the various states. That is, on a basis of a mathematical formula, after a certain number of votes have been calculated in the various districts within a state, the networks and their electronic affiliates feel confident to say Arizona goes to candidate A, but California goes to candidate B, and so forth. This time around, though, was unique for a particular reason. there was this enormous number of mail-in ballots and advance voting. Somewhere in the neighborhood of over 100 million people availed themselves of that opportunity, largely because of the concerns over the contagion of the COVID virus. And so people, many of them obviously felt very strongly that it would be safer for them personally if they either mailed in a ballot that was provided to them or showed up on days ahead of time when the crowds would not be so large, do their requisite social distance, cast their vote, and then go home. But the problem then became that in many states, the regulations had been set up by the various state legislatures. Now, pause on that note, because unlike most countries, there's not one national voting authority. So that each state, all across the country, each state has its own administration and authority, and the laws governing elections are a little bit different one state to the next. But in a number of the key states, and most especially Pennsylvania, it had been legally mandated that none of the mail-in or advance votes would be counted until after all of the votes from day of election voting. And so that put this enormous burden on the vote counting machinery to deal with what would effectively have been millions of additional votes beyond the ones that had been tabulated by voting machines in many ways, or by hand counting in some smaller counties across the state. Now, the problem was that led some people, perhaps with a little bit of wickedness in their hearts, to complain that this was going to be a way that the election was going to be stolen from, in this case, Donald Trump, that somehow there were secret caches of ballots that would be dumped into the system as the counting went on. But it's important to remember that all of the votes that were being counted were not new votes beyond the day of election, except in a few cases where the mail system delivered these accepted ballots postmarked by the day of election, delivered them in the 2 days after election day. All the votes had already been cast. And so it's really difficult to visualize how somebody in a room somewhere can suddenly create new ballots and dump them into the system surreptitiously when the whole process is being watched by news teams and by observers from both of the political parties, as well as the whole management structure of the vote counting apparatus. So that leads you into a discussion, if you want to go there, of the kinds of legal issues that the current president is trying to pursue to somehow pull that rabbit out of a hat.
And I mean, you speak about those legal issues, and of course, we heard, was it on Thursday or Friday, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, of course, wanting to launch that appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mr. Spector, you speak about the challenges. Of course, you've got the U.S. Postal Service who's dealing with the mail-ins. You've got, of course, the social distancing that needs to be done. Then, of course, as stated, each state has their own sort of legislation with regards to elections. All of those challenges taken in, and yet the Electoral College was still able to go ahead and make sure that those votes were counted, albeit, you know, obviously past the 2 or 3 days that we're used to seeing it. So when you look at that, I mean, those involved in these elections and making sure all the votes were counted, they definitely do deserve the credit right over there, especially in a time that we're living in with this pandemic.
Oh, no, they definitely deserve a holiday bonus, all those people who did the vote counting. Some of them, in fact, and you could see it because of, you know, the fact that we're hours ahead of the time zones in the United States, or put it another way, if you got up early in the morning to watch the process, you would see vote counting taking place late at night. There were people who had agreed to stay and work all the way through the night. People would send in coffee and sandwiches and donuts or whatever. And there they were at their desks doing what had to be done to make sure that all the votes were counted. There's another complexity to mail-in ballots, which wasn't that well explained to most people, but consider this. When you go into a voting station and you cast your ballot in the little booth. In most places now, it's automatically done. It's a machine. It's, you make your mark or you pull a lever and the vote is cast and the machine tabulates it, and then various things get done to make sure that the reconciliation is accurate. But in the case of a mail-in ballot, first you have an actual paper ballot, and you have to sign it in the appropriate place, and in some states get it witnessed, and it's barcoded, but it's been folded up and placed in what they call an anonymous envelope. In other words, the envelope has no exterior markings on it, so no one can identify who it's from or where it's from within that state. And then that envelope is then placed inside the actual mailing envelope that is sent from the person to the electoral officials. Now, the problem is, think about this, when you get that, and now it's two envelopes, and it's a ballot that has been folded up, sort of like an accordion, put inside the one envelope, and that envelope is now put inside the other envelope. So instead of a machine doing a tabulation of your vote, some poor person is sitting behind a desk, opening up envelope A, checking to make sure there's nothing untoward inside that envelope, taking out the anonymous envelope, now opening that, checking that there's no extraneous material in it or no obvious markings on the outside, taking it, then folding it out so it's flat to be counted. Sometimes it's gotten crinkled by the mail system or the way it was handled, so they have to smooth it out. Sometimes it may have even been torn. And you now have this, and so it's taking much longer to process each mailed in ballot than it would be if you or I walked into the voting station, went up to the booth, and pulled our various levers. So all of that added to the time, which is why you saw on television, as you watched the news channels, or if you watched it online, the newscasters or the correspondents were saying, we've got to be patient to let the process go through. We've got to be patient so that all the ballots could be counted. But Americans tend to be an impatient bunch, and they tend to want, where was fast food invented, right? We tend to want our things right now. We want our ballot information, who won the election, right now. It's never quite fast enough. But now, patience pays off eventually.
Yeah, patience is definitely the virtue. Well, stay tuned to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with Mr. Brooks Spector, and we will be discussing the United States election. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. The conversation is about the U.S. elections and, of course, the victory by Joe Biden. I'm still with Mr. Brooks Spector. Mr. Spector, let's look at the states that were won by, of course, each of the representatives. Joe Biden, of course, taking Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, Arizona. The states won by Donald Trump was North Carolina, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas. The two that Joe Biden, of course, won, which really made that significant difference, was, of course, Georgia and Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of people would say or ask, why those two states? Explain to us, Mr. Brooks Spector, how important were those two states in securing that victory for President-elect Biden?
Well, it's a good question. It's one people often ask. Many of the states, places like New York or California or Texas or Illinois, they're large states, but largely the electorate in those states is known to be favorable, in the case of California or Illinois or New York, favorable to Democrats by significant margins, but they're big voting states, and therefore they have large electoral weight. A place like Texas has been, for the last several decades, known to be Republican, again, also very large. But let's talk a little bit about not only Pennsylvania and Georgia, but let's talk about Florida as well for just a second. So in the case of Pennsylvania and Florida, especially, these are large, complicated states, lots of demographic diversity, big cities, small towns, rural areas, all sort of mixed together. Significant racial and ethnic minorities in the big cities of those states, and the rural areas, the small towns, tend to be, on the whole, for the most part, older white Americans, often not college educated, university educated, that is, and more traditionally oriented on social and economic issues. In the case of Pennsylvania, because of its electoral weight, 20 votes out of the 270 needed to win, two big cities are in Pennsylvania. There's Philadelphia on the eastern side, Pittsburgh on the west, and right around Philadelphia is a large ring of suburban areas. Now, the two main urban areas, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, are traditionally Democratic Party strongholds. The suburbs around Philadelphia, of which there are millions of people, have historically been Republican in the old style of Republicans, but over certainly the last 2 years, there's been a marked change in the way the voters in those areas, mostly better off, mostly white, but not entirely, better educated, have turned against Donald Trump and many of his behaviors, values, and positions. And so when you hear people talk about the gender gap, the white, middle class, suburban, university educated voter, they're talking about a shift from being Republican supporters to now being significantly Democratic Party supporters. The middle of the state is still largely rural, small towns, and it has a definite socially conservative view. So the state itself is now balanced between those two very different versions of its citizenry. And so it becomes a hotly contested state, what they call in the United States a swing state. That is, it can swing from one party to the other, depending on the candidates and the way the issues are framed. Georgia is a little different. It's a state that 50 years ago was solidly Democratic, but that was at a time when many, perhaps most, at least 50 years ago, most African Americans would have found it extremely difficult to be able to register and then actually cast their votes because of the segregation that had been practiced there and the racial nature of the government from the end of the Civil War, basically. But Georgia is changing. The city of Atlanta, which many people know of, has become a much larger, complex, cosmopolitan area with significant influx of people from other parts of the country drawn there because of jobs in finance and communications and universities and other areas that are not part of the old segregated South. And in the meantime, because of the Voting Rights Act and many efforts to register African Americans to be able to exercise their voting franchise, the demography of Georgia itself has, in recent years, has become rather different than the model we might have thought of 50, 60 years ago. And as a result, that became a swing state now too, to the surprise of many. Florida is a little different. There are major concentrations of very different populations in the state. And when you try to market your candidate to the citizens in Florida, you're actually trying to deal with 5 or 6 regionally discrete versions of populations in the north and more rural areas, in the area around the city of Jacksonville, and then the Tampa, St. Petersburg area on the West Coast, on the Caribbean Sea, and Orlando, of course, because everybody knows where Disney World is,
Yes.
and Miami, Miami Beach, Dade County more generally. And so each of these areas that we talked about have their own media markets, but they also have strikingly different populations. So that in a place like Miami, you will have the older established populations that have been there for many, many years, but you also have a large concentration of African Americans, and then two or three very distinctly different versions of Hispanic Americans. You have Puerto Ricans who've migrated from the island of Puerto Rico, who are obviously American citizens, settle in Miami, in the Miami area, and now vote. Although they're Spanish speaking at home, they're very different than the Cuban Americans who migrated there in large part in the years following Fidel Castro's takeover of the island. You also have significant African American populations in each of the major cities, from Jacksonville all the way down to Miami. And in recent years, so certainly in the last 40 or 50 years, there's been a continuing migration of people from the north who want to retire to Florida. Why? The weather is much more benign. It never snows in Florida. There's the beach. There's pleasant living, relatively speaking. Cost of living is a little lower, and the more retirees that cluster there, the more likely it is more retirees will cluster there. And as a result, you have all these distinctive populations in Florida too, which has over time made it something of a swing state as well. As you note in the Gore-Bush election, it was balanced on a knife edge, somewhere between 1,500 and 500 votes separated the two candidates in the various recounts. And then you move further to the west, and you get Arizona, which has significantly changed from its old style Wild West look. Phoenix, Arizona is one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and it's 60% of the population of the entire state. And Nevada, who hasn't heard of Las Vegas? Las Vegas is most of the, and the area around it, Clark County, is most of the population of the state of Nevada. So if you win in Las Vegas, you've won the state. And it's Las Vegas is largely a service industry: hotels, casinos, entertainment, amusement park, the full range of things. It's now increasingly a family entertainment destination rather than the old style casinos and gambling. So each of the states has a different complexion, makeup, and texture. But the nature of being a swing state means there are competing possibilities to win. So if you win the states that are clearly going to be yours, and you win swing states, and in the case of Joe Biden, if you reclaim Michigan and Wisconsin, which were states reliably Democratic for many, many years and captured by Donald Trump in the last election, Joe Biden wins the election because he's put together the geographic and the ethnic and the racial and the economic and the demographic in terms of age coalition necessary to come out on the top. Even having said that, it was close in a number of those states, although the difference in popular vote it's now approaching 5 million votes, which is not an inconsiderable thing.
Brooke Spector, we are, of course, going to take this discussion after the break, and we will be discussing the legacy of Donald Trump, but it was a legacy that had more questions than actual answers. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with Mr. Brooke Spector, former U.S. diplomat and associate editor at the Daily Maverick. Mr. Spector, of course, Joe Biden takes the shine because he is the president-elect. But Kamala Harris, not only is she female, but she's also female color. Talk to us about the significance of her being the vice president, somebody who is making history for all the right reasons?
She's not the first person who was nominated to be vice president who was female, but she's the first vice presidential candidate who has been successful who is female. Sarah Palin with John McCain was nominated, and when Walter Mondale ran for president in 1984, Geraldine Ferraro was his running mate, and in both cases, Walter Mondale and John McCain. Of course, they didn't win, and not to ignore this, but Hillary Clinton ran for the top spot the last election, gained more votes than Donald Trump did, but did not cross the electoral vote threshold. Kamala Harris speaks to that new America we were talking about a little bit before, the cosmopolitan mixture of people. One parent, her mother comes from South India, her father comes from Jamaica. They meet in California at a civil rights rally and protest in a town, either Oakland or San Francisco. They lived in Oakland, I believe. That was itself a sort of a hothouse of cosmopolitanness and at the time, certainly radical politics. And she, although her background was Indian, South Asian stroke Caribbean, in her own mind, to settle on the question of identity, she chose to attend Howard University in Washington, D.C. Howard University was the first and arguably the most famous of the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. It was established in 1867, and it has long been the gem and the crown of historically Black colleges and universities. And most of the student population is and has been African American, with a sprinkling of students from outside of the country. But again, many of them Caribbean, those who come from out of the country, Caribbean or from Africa, the African diaspora on one campus. And in doing this, she, in a voyage of self-discovery or deliberate making or remaking of herself, she found that was the secure identity that she could embrace and felt warm and comfortable, comfortable within. And as a result, that began to be the way she saw herself. And when she moved back to California and eventually ran for the prosecutor of the city of San Francisco, she was clearly seen by voters as certainly Black, but with the kind of mixed background that many people in San Francisco do have. And then when she ran for Attorney General of the state of California, same thing applies. And California is one of those places that already is or will shortly be minority majority. That is to say, if you look at the ethnic composition of the state of California, there will be, or already are, more people who are other than white in California than there are white Californians. But it's a range of people, Asian Americans, whether they're Chinese American and Japanese American, Filipino American, people who are Hispanic American, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, and all of the possible mixes among them. And just as an aside, one of the fastest growing census categories in the United States is people who have parents from different ethnicities, different races. And the Census Bureau now has a category where people can tick that box finally. And Kamala Harris might well ponder the question of whether she wanted to tick that box or African American or both of them. I think that's allowed now too. But in any case, she went from being Attorney General of California to being a senator, California, with all of that prosecutorial background, she was the ideal person to pursue very tough, very thorough investigations in the confirmation hearings of the Supreme Court justices nominated by Donald Trump during his term of office. There were three of them. And she built a national reputation on that. And then by picking her, Joe Biden actually picked someone who had grilled him hard in one of the early primary debates over the very question of racial identity and integration of public schools. In doing this, I think Joe Biden made the bet that A, she was confident, she was competent, she was aggressive in a strong and good way, knowledgeable, but that she also represented the future of the country, which is not neat little blocks of this kind of person and that kind of person. Oh, and if I left it out, I should mention also that her husband is a Jewish American who is an entertainment rights lawyer, and they met on a blind date some years ago. So that's the kind of California that she comes from, and it was a savvy choice because she turned out to be really good on the campaign trail, and her earnestness and Joe Biden's ability to project empathy really allowed voters to say, I want these people in my corner, or at least a significant enough number of them that they won. I think these people understand me, and I think they sympathize with me, and they have my back, rather than just the anger that Donald Trump was managing to stir up with his policies, his pronouncements, and ultimately his incompetence.
Mr. Spector, just to wrap up the conversation, of course, the challenges that do lie ahead for President-elect Biden. We've got, of course, the racial tensions that are still there and, of course, were fired up so largely under the presidency of Donald Trump. And, of course, you mentioned it in your article in the Daily Maverick about how, the comparisons with the American Civil War was brought into it. The foreign policy with regards to China, Venezuela, Iran, and then, of course, the Middle East, and of course, the hot topic that is there. And of course, some of the normalization of ties that have been done with Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan with Israel. Then, of course, this climate change, of course, something that Donald Trump just had, shoved away together, especially when, Greta Thunberg, the activist, wanted to speak to him. All of those challenges that Joe Biden has in the 4 years when he does step in to the White House, how is he going to go ahead and deal with that and restore the confidence for the Americans, with the Americans of all ethnic backgrounds?
Well, I think that let me take the policy priorities first, and then talk about restoration of values and support. He's made it very clear that job one for Joe Biden's administration, job one is the pandemic and dealing with it nationally, effectively, competent, and cogently and coherently throughout the whole country together. And from that, then the economy can be healed to a considerable degree. And from that, then there is at least the possibility of restoring some semblance of agreement on racial redress and dealing with grievances. People who don't have jobs and people who have no income tend to be rather angry. People who have jobs and the opportunity to get them tend to be more satisfied with their circumstances because their circumstances are getting better. I mean, that's put together rather simplistically, but you can see the order of the things. But what you should draw from that is that those are all domestic issues. They are all domestic concerns, because those are the things that he ran on. And you add to that, I'm going to replace a man who was starkly incompetent and unfeeling, and you get a sense of how his priorities are put together. But as he looks to the international sphere, there are obviously some things, and you've touched on them. One of the things he has promised to do very early in the presidency is to reassociate the U.S. With the Paris Climate Accord that Donald Trump withdrew from. That he's going to reestablish relations with the World Health Organization. Given the pandemic, it seems like a perfectly logical thing to do. He's going to work to reestablish American participation in the Six Power Accord on Iran's nuclear development. Again, a logical thing to do. And in terms of dealing with China, it is quite clear that all of the people writing about the policy choices for Joe Biden argue that dealing with China got off on the wrong foot because Donald Trump insisted that it was a one-on-one issue, U.S.-China, instead of all of the major trading partners of China together insisting that there needs to be a fair understanding of the transparency of trade rules and the way in which they are enforced fairly, openly, and above board. And you certainly get more oomph if you have all the countries, the big countries of Western Europe, perhaps South Asia, and certainly East Asia, cooperating on this. All of that very difficult, but certainly not impossible. And then there's always the issue of North Korea. The cooperative version of these things would be South Korea, Japan, China, and the US. Now, all four of these countries have their differences, but they also all do not feel very comfortable with the idea of a nuclear power that operates outside of the restraints and the constraints that the rest of the world understands and accepts. So there are obviously areas for international cooperation quickly, and even to restore just the civility of dealing with people. It was often said that Donald Trump spent more time insulting and being angry to American allies and being very nice, pleasant, and even obsequious to America's opponents. And we can talk about Vladimir Putin, the very strange Vladimir Putin-Donald Trump relationship, which I don't think any of us will ever quite figure out. And other authoritarians, the people who run Hungary, the people who run Saudi Arabia, and other such countries. Donald Trump seemed to like that, and that did not appear to be the kind of thing Americans appreciate or like. And in Joe Biden's initial speeches and articles, many of which I have looked at, it was very clear that democracy at home has to be the calling card for dealing with countries abroad, despots abroad. And as far as the smaller circle of the Middle East, one thing I'd like to dispel a little bit. I really don't think it's fair to say that the normalization accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and now notionally Sudan, are Donald Trump's doing nearly as much as they are the goals, the needs, the interests of those sovereign states on their own, all of whom had good and solid reasons to want to reach those accords. Did Donald Trump offer some sweetening to some of them along the way? Of course. But did the impetus come from Donald Trump, or did they come from the countries concerned? I think that's fair to say. What you should take away from that is that as far as Joe Biden is concerned, in large measure, dealing with the Middle East and all of its various conundrums, you're going to see in large part a return to the style and the approach that we saw during Barack Obama administration. Joe Biden was, after all, a major part of that. And he was often involved in the diplomatic discussions abroad. So I don't think you're going to see a revolutionary version of international relations. You're going to see, in large measure, a continuation of the style and the attitudes, if not the specifics, of what went before the 4 years that was the Donald Trump administration.
Mr. Brooks Spector, I wish we could talk more. I wish we could extend this for another hour, but we do have time restraints with regards to that. So we'd like to thank you so much for making the time for us here on ITV Networks on Truth to Power. And hopefully we'll speak to you again when, of course, the inauguration of the president does happen. And, you know, his challenges, of course, we do not know the situation with regards to COVID-19, how it will be, you know, come January 2021. But we'd like to have you again just to, of course, talk more in depth about the visions, the aims, and, of course, the challenges that face President-elect Biden. We thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. That is, of course, Mr. Brooks Spector, former U.S. diplomat and associate editor at the Daily Maverick. Well, there we go. One of the most highly tightly contested elections in the United States has come to a conclusion with Joe Biden being the new president, the 46th of the United States democracy. Well, that's all we have for you on Truth to Power. To enjoy the rest of your week and your weekend, and I will see you again same time, same place, right here on channel 347 DSTV. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.